This is Duke University.
Thank you for joining our webinar on Ecosystem Services Planning and Management. Today's webinar is one of several that Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions will host in calendar year 2015. Each webinar will provide the opportunity to interact with our researchers as they discuss work across our 6 programs and its impact in environmental policy in our first decade. In a moment, Lydia Olander, who directs the Ecosystem Services Program at the Nicholas Institute and leads the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, will discuss a new online guidebook designed to aid ecosystem services planning and management. Lydia will offer the impetus for the Federal Resource Management and Ecosystem Services Guidebook, describe how agencies are using it, and walk participants through its contents. We'll also feature time for questions, which can be entered in the chat window to the right of your screen at any time during the webinar. Lydia?
Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So I'm just going to briefly start by telling you about the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, which is housed here at the Nicholas Institute. This institution really got underway with the support of the Environmental Protection Agency in the late 2000s. And the idea was to engage both public and private individuals and organizations to enhance collaboration within the ecosystem services community, strengthening coordination of policy and market implementation and research at the national level. And through that partnership, this guidebook came about in conversations with federal agencies. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story and then walk you through the guidebook. So first of all, just for those who are new to the concept, what are ecosystem services? So ecosystem services are the benefits that nature provides to people. So it's really linking the ecological systems and the things that we get from them to the benefits that they bring to people. And the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is a fairly well-known framework that's been developed to help people think about ecosystem services. And they talk about services like provisioning services, which are the ones we're more familiar with, goods or products like wood and fish. There's also regulating services that we think about, such as pollination, but also things like flood mitigation. There's cultural services as well. These are recreational benefits we get from open places, but also just places we care about or feel strongly attached to, have historical or cultural connections to. And then there's supporting services, functions that kind of support everything else, so things like photosynthesis and food web stability and decomposition. So these are the categories that the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment uses and a number of people are familiar with. But these are the types of benefits that nature provides to people. And then the question is, how do we use these in thinking about policy and management? And we're going to talk more about that today. So this ecosystem services term and the approach to applying it to different decisions has been really growing over the last few decades. There's been an exponential growth over the last 10 to 15 years in research, and there's been a longer history in the resource economics community. And what we're seeing is it's beginning to show up not just in research, but now more and more over the last decade in the corporate discourse and in mainstream media. We see companies like Dow Chemical Company and the Caring Company using ecosystem services for trying to consider how to incorporate it into various decisions they're making. You see it in the newspaper. We also are seeing ecosystem services in other institutions. We see large environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy trying to figure out how it fits into the way they think about conservation. Large universities are engaged, and a growth of an international space as well. People like the institutions like the World Bank and the United Nations trying to incorporate it into wealth accounting for ecosystem services and how countries make decisions about their natural resources. So ecosystem services is a lens not only to study and analyze natural resources, but also to now manage it. And this is becoming more and more a conversation both in the U.S. and internationally. So why create a guidebook? So there's been a growing momentum, as I've mentioned. In particular, this slide shows what's been happening in the U.S. And it walks through kind of the last 15 years or so. There's been some reports that have, like the President Council on Advisors in Science and Technology reports that have really kind of brought this ecosystem services approach to the attention of decision makers and talked about potential implementation issues. And there was a 1998 report, and then recently in 2011 there was another report that revisited and talked more specifically about implementation. And then in the meantime, there were things like the 2008 Farm Bill, which was the first time ecosystem services had been seen in legislative language, that established the USDA Office of Ecosystem Services and Markets, which is now the Office of Environmental Markets, that still is in existence and working today. And also ecosystem services was integrated into the Wetlands Compensatory Mitigation Rule. And since then there was a series of dialogues within the federal agencies, and then in 2012 the Forest Service's new planning rule incorporated ecosystem services. And in 2013 the Council on Environmental Quality put out new principles and requirements for federal investments in water resources that also incorporates the idea of ecosystem services. So there's this growing interest and kind of sense that ecosystem services can improve the way we do resource management and planning. But then there's a sense that we're not exactly sure how to implement this on the ground. This is still a relatively new concept in terms of how do we implement it and apply it. And in early 2012, we had a conversation with a number of the federal agencies that really wanted to figure out how to fill that space or to fill that gap between concept and practice. So I'm going to walk through here the kind of the goals of the project that came out of that conversation with the agencies in early 2012. And the first was to fill this gap between the concept of ecosystem services and what it meant in practice. The second was to educate newcomers to this concept and managers who are working on the ground making the decisions. Another thing that was really of interest was a shared learning process. A bunch of the agencies were dabbling in ecosystem services and thinking about this, trying different approaches. There was a desire to not reinvent the wheel and to learn from each other, and so one of the things we wanted to do was have a community that could talk together and learn together. We also thought it was very important to kind of emphasize and reinforce the need to connect the ecological and the social methods. Ecosystem services is about connecting nature to people, so we have to have both of these pieces to make this work. We also wanted to think about a common framework that could span decision context and geography so that we have a consistent way that we're thinking about and applying an ecosystem services approach. There were also concerns about the credibility of this approach. Since it was new, is it credible? Will there be pushback, or is the science back it up? And so we really wanted to bring together agency and academic experts to bring that credibility to bear and show the support and science behind it. But we also wanted to remain practical in terms of how you would apply and implement something in the real decision-making context. So these are all things we wanted to do. And the idea was to put this all into a guidebook and a resource for federal agencies, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So a little background, the guidebook was created over a 2-year period, and there were 2 streams of work involved in this process. The first really involved the practitioners and the agencies who helped us understand what the issues were, where they were in the process, and what would be useful to them. They helped write a number of sections about what was happening within the agencies and some examples. They were part of a community of practice of shared learning that talked about what they were doing on the ground, but also gave us feedback on what went into the guidebook and helped review and advise the process along the way. The other stream was a group of technical experts, and these came from academia, NGOs, consulting firms, and also from the agencies. And we had a series of working groups, one through the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and the other through the Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. And both of these have funding from the National Science Foundation to support working groups. And so we brought together these technical experts in a series of working groups and talked through what are the methods, what is the assessment framework and the methods behind doing an ecosystem service assessment in management and planning contexts. And so we pulled together really the kind of the consensus of what do these methods look like, how do they work together, what are our best options, and that became part of the guidebook. We also discussed what are the data needs, what kinds of models do we need, both ecological and social, and we're currently putting together a kind of an overview of what do we know about our current capabilities as well as the gaps and how to fill those. And so this all was pulled together into the online guidebook we'll be showing today. There were over 150 people participated in this project. There's a broad list here you can look at to see who some of our partners and who some of the folks involved were. but just to point out that some of the leading institutions, so in addition to myself here at Duke, we had Dean Urban, who's a faculty member at the Nicholas School. We had Lynn Scarlett, who's with the Nature Conservancy and formerly with the Department of Interior, and she helped us engage significantly with agencies in that department. We also had Jim Boyd from Resources for the Future, who gave us his insights and advice along the way, and Sally Collins, who is currently a private consultant, but was formerly with the U.S. Forest Service and the USDA, and did a lot of work on ecosystem services and helped us engage the Forest Service significantly in this process, as well as giving us her wisdom. Our primary funder for the work was the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, but as you can see, we had a lot of support from various other institutions. And the other thing you can see here is our agency partners. So we had a lot of support and engagement and writing by these agency partners, and you'll see a little bit more of that in the guidebook when I show you the tour of that. So just to step back for a minute and talk about what we are talking about when we say an ecosystem services approach to resource management. When we think about how people kind of previously or typically think about managing a resource, we often think in terms of things like measuring the quantity or quality of the resource. So the extent of forest that we have, the details about the stand age or the species that are in the forest. So you're getting a kind of a quality and quantity measure. But we're trying to, in addition to these kinds of measures, think about the benefits that this forest provides to people. And so there are a whole bunch of different things you might include. You might think about how hikers and hunters and local timber companies get value from the forest. You also might think about those who are not on the forest or using the forest directly, but get other benefits, like folks that are within the same watershed that may benefit from water quality improvements or some effects on flooding that are affected by the forest above. There also might be folks who enjoy the wildlife or birds that come off of that forest that go to neighboring communities. And then folks even further away. There may be people that have a cultural connection or a historic connection to a piece of land or a forest, or those who just care significantly that there are mature forests there for them or future generations or for the species that live in those forests. So there's a whole bunch of different potential beneficiaries that actually find significant value in these various benefits, and these can also be included as ecosystem services in addition to the quantity and quality measures that we're used to. So agencies may have provided consideration of some of these broader objectives and benefits in the past. We see that Forest Service is a multi-use agency. They think about a number of these things already, but we're expanding that definition into new types of benefits. We're also thinking about new analytical techniques, new data, and new insights, kind of a more systemic and more holistic approach that kind of these new science and economic methods are allowing us to apply. So I'm going to walk through the guidebook here in a moment. There are three main pieces to the guidebook. The first is really the background and the introduction. What is this ecosystem services stuff? Why is it useful to us? The second piece is about the agencies and where they are in this process and how they're thinking about ecosystem services. And the third piece is the assessment framework or the methods for ecosystem services. But before I dive into that tour, I just want to mention briefly kind of where we are in this process. The guidebook is really brand new. It was released at the end of December, and we're really in the process of getting the word out now, trying to let everybody know about this guidebook and see how they might find it useful. Some of the initial things, initial uses that we've heard about. The Forest Service, who we've been engaging with throughout the process, there's a group in California that's doing regional planning that's incorporating some of these ideas. There's also a kind of a national team trying to work on assessment tools for applying the new planning rule within the Forest Service, and they're also looking to the guidebook to see if they can harness different ideas from it as they build those tools. We conducted a training on the guidebook, on the methods in the guidebook at the Community on Ecosystem Services conference in December, and got a really great feedback from folks, from the agencies, from consulting firms, from NGOs. And we understand that the one person from the Nature Conservancy is now using this for a training that they did with NOAA. So there's training materials that are available too. There's also some folks who have been using this to understand what others are up to, trying to figure out what other agencies are doing, to figure out whether there's other values. We've started to incorporate other resources here that people are finding useful. And I also understand that there's a Congressional Research Service report underway on ecosystem services, and I know the guidebook's been a resource for that effort as well. So now I am going to switch over, so be a slight pause here as I switch over to the online guidebook. All right, so now you should be seeing the online live version of the guidebook, so you can follow along here. You can pull it up on your browser and go beyond what I'm showing you if you want while we're doing this. So I'm just really going to walk through step by step kind of what's included in the guidebook so you can get a sense of this resource. So the first thing is just about the project. So we have a section here that talks a lot about what I already mentioned, which is who is involved and how are they involved, and how is the process pulled together. And so a lot of that information is in the About the Guidebook section. The other thing I want to point to here is that we've also posted our guidebook training resources online, and so you can access that here. And this includes two different things. One is a series of slide decks we've prepared about the guidebook and the guidebook content that might be useful in sharing with other people what's in the guidebook and getting a kind of another view on that. There's also a series of workshop materials, and these come from the training we did at the ACES conference. And these include both the slide decks as well as some exercise materials that were used. So these might be useful to folks as they move forward in incorporating ecosystem services into their work. The next section of the guidebook I'm going to go to is the Why Ecosystem Services section. And this is our introductory section where we talk about what are ecosystem services, how they might be useful to resource managers. We talk a bit about the different kinds of benefits people might see from using this approach, as well as some of the challenges that might be faced. The other thing in this section that there's a couple other sections just as kind of background, but one is frequently asked questions. We got a lot of different questions that were both general about things like, does everything have to have a dollar value on it? And we note that that's not true. You don't have to have a dollar value to use an ecosystem services approach. But we also talk about specific things that are agency relevant, like how does ecosystem services fit with multi-use planning, for example. So a variety of different questions that came up during the process are answered here. In addition, we have a short section which is about whether ecosystem services is right for your project. So just try to set up some general kind of context and questions to think about when you're trying to decide whether to move forward with an ecosystem services approach or basically how much investment you want to make in one. These kinds of questions might help answer those questions for a resource manager. The next section of the guidebook, called Agency Use, this section was written by the agencies. So our agency partners wrote sections about what they are doing within their agencies, how they are incorporating ecosystem services, what decision contexts. And I'm going to just open up here one of them to show a little bit more detail. So look at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Most of these sections talk about the historical context, the decision context, and the institutional context in which ecosystem services are being applied. They are also here, agency explorations and applications are noted, and I want to point to, there's a whole section, another section of the guidebook, which I'm going to go to right now, which has these detailed cases and examples that the agencies have written up. So people on the ground or within the agencies working on specific policies have written these sections that talk about these different examples. So we have things that are from these regional examples from the Bureau of Land Management related to citing or regulatory issues. The U.S. EPA has one on their air quality standards for NOx and SOx and how they're incorporating ecosystem services. Fish and Wildlife have a number of examples about how they're thinking about ecosystem services on refuges. The Forest Service has a lot of different examples ranging from projects to institutional kind of questions about how ecosystem services fit in, as well as an assessment framework for ecosystem services. And NOAA has one case study that's regional around the Puget Sound and another one that's more institutional about how they're incorporating blue carbon. So a real range of different kinds of examples from the agencies. One more thing in the agency use section that I want to draw people's attention to is the section on legal authorities. So while we only got to do 2 different legal authorities, we hit two of the big ones. We had some legal experts work with us to assess whether there were any barriers to applying an ecosystem services approach within some of the key legal authorities. And so we have one on the National Environmental Policy Act and one on the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. And the bottom line is there aren't barriers, and that there's a lot of consistency with these laws and the use of an ecosystem services approach. All right, the next section is the assessment framework. And this section is the methods section. And the framework overview really provides the big picture. It talks about all the different types of methods you might want to use, how they compare to one another, how they fit together. So it provides the big picture of the different methods that are used and how they work. I'm going to slide down to show you a little bit about how it's organized. The federal agencies all use an adaptive management cycle of some sort. This shows a variety of different diagrams. They all have different ways of putting it, but they all have adaptive management cycle kind of built into their planning process. And so we used a generic version of this to walk through ecosystem services framework. So we have a very generic version of an adaptive management process, and then we talk through the different steps and then the methods that are applied at each of these steps. And so that's the organizing approach for the methods that we've presented here. Okay. And then I'm just going to talk through a little bit about what's in this section in more detail. So we talk about this first kind of broad stage of scoping, and in this there are ecological assessments that need to happen in terms of status and trends. There's also stakeholder engagement process, and so we talk about some of those. We also talk a little bit about how you might go about identifying services. So there's a lot of kind of background stuff that has to happen at this stage, and we talk about some of those steps. And then there's an ecological assessment step, and then we talk about an approach that's using what we call means-ends diagram. And these are a box and arrow diagram types approach, but we're using it really to link together management actions through the kind of ecological cascade of all the things that are affected, all the functions and ecological functions that are affected, and tie that to the actual services that are provided and the benefits those provide to people, so that we can connect management to ecosystem services. And so we talk through that approach and what it looks like. The next step is really integrating the ecological and social side. So we talk about how that works, how you kind of take ecological indicators and make them relevant for the social science side of this. We talk about indicators that are relevant for social impact analysis, and we're starting to incorporate social data about how many people are using a service, whether there's alternatives, substitutes that they could use, other kinds of information that affect the use of the service and the benefits that people gain. Then we walk through social impact analysis methods. By these we mean monetary valuation approaches. We give a high-level discussion of what those are and point people to other resources for more details. And then we talk about non-monetary multi-criteria evaluation methods. These are very good. These types of methods are very good for stakeholder engagement, conflict resolution type discussions. And then we briefly mentioned that there are other methods out there, but we don't have kind of the strong consensus in the science around other methods for this kind of approach. So we just talked briefly about some other things that are out there, but we don't have as much detail. Then on the decision process, we talk through how this process will work and the use of alternative matrices, which is a pretty standard way perhaps to look at things, but can provide a nice transparent approach to kind of laying out your different management alternatives, your different projects you're choosing before, your different policy options, and talking about how those different scenarios affect each one of your services. And it's a transparent way to provide that data. We realize sometimes these matrices will be filled out with different kinds of information. So sometimes you will have qualitative information, sometimes you'll have dollar values. It'll range potentially based on what information you have available. We also talk about how, if possible, you'd love to get to be able to do a full trade-off analysis, and to be able to do that, you're going to probably need to use an economic valuation type approach or a non-monetary approach that we discussed in the social impact analysis. And then the other thing I'd like to point out is we have a discussion of scenario analysis and green accounting. So our guidebook really talks about the comparison of different projects, management alternatives, or policies. So it's a scenario analysis that we walk through. And there are other uses for ecosystem services approaches, and one of those is green accounting. And these are very complementary pieces, but a little bit different in kind of how they're targeted. And so this talks through how those relate to one another. Okay. And then the last thing I'm going to point to is this community dialogue piece on the website. So we added this so that as people start using the guidebook, it could provide an opportunity for people to talk to each other about what they're finding, to add new resources in as they come out, new papers, new examples. So potentially provide a way for the guidebook to remain a bit of a living resource as new things happen over time. We hope to, be incorporating new things over time into the guidebook itself, but in the meantime, this would be a way to provide an opportunity for ongoing dialogue for users of the guidebook. Okay. So I'm going to switch back. So just pause for a moment. Okay. So I just wanted to briefly talk about kind of where we are now and what's coming next. So there are a few things we're already planning to do that will add to the guidebook. I mentioned briefly that we're pulling together a piece now on data and models available on the ecological and social side, and we hope to incorporate that information into the guidebook when it's complete. We also know that there's work underway on some tools by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Corps of Engineers, one on pulling together production functions, ecological production function models, and another on broadly looking at various tools that are available for incorporating ecosystem services. And these are resources to kind of like libraries to collect those kinds of information. And when those become available, we'll hopefully be able to post those on the guidebook site. We also are looking at an effort to better understand kind of practical implementation issues. What do you do when you have incomplete data, or you have a group that does not want to incorporate dollar values into different ecosystem services? What are the approaches that can be used, and how do we pull those together? And so we may be putting out a piece on practical implementation issues as well. Then I want to talk about next steps beyond that. We'd love to move on to a guidebook version 2.0. This guidebook is, I think, a great start, but there's definitely a lot of detail and questions about which methods work best where, about building detailed examples of implementation and application, about training agency experts and building capacity on the ground through projects. There's been questions about whether we could add some green infrastructure examples. These are all things we would love to do, given the right partners and resources to do that. We're also thinking about whether there's a need to adapt this for other user groups. Would other examples or touching on specific issues that are relevant to different groups be helpful? And there have been some folks who have been interested in thinking about either new training material or integrating aspects of this ecosystem services work into other trainings that are underway. So these are all things we are thinking about and trying to look for different potential partners and funders to move forward. So I'm going to stop there, I think, and we'll be taking some questions from the audience. Okay, so the first question is, would you consider clean water an indicator of ecosystem service, and would you have to have numbers of users? And so, so the answer is, for the way we think about this, if you have an activity, a management activity, a project or program that changes the cleanliness of the water. So if you end up making it cleaner or dirtier, that is an effect on a potential ecosystem service. But you would also need to have information on who was affected by that change to actually be able to quantify the change in ecosystem services provided to people. Okay, so there was a question about when do you use an ecosystem services approach? And so I mentioned briefly that we have a section on that in the guidebook. And we talk about it as, if you're engaging in a decision where there are engaged communities, those that will be affected by the change in natural resources, in a place that has assets with national or global significance, endangered species or at-risk species, for example. Those are places where you might want to do this. Another would be where you have stakeholders that have conflicting priorities, so different ecosystem services and benefits are critical to different groups. So trying to think about the trade-offs across the provision of those services, that's a useful place for this kind of a tool. Also, I think another thing is where there are significant benefits or costs that are falling outside of traditional boundaries. So one of the things we've seen, for example, with the Forest Service is that they have found some examples where the way they manage their forests to reduce forest fire has significant impacts on sedimentation and water supply costs for some of the communities below. So in Denver and in Santa Fe, there's programs, payment for ecosystem services programs that have built because of what's happening downstream and off-site from the forest. So it's kind of thinking about the services that are provided to the surrounding communities has been a valuable reason to look at ecosystem services. So I think really trying to understand our ecosystem services important for this decision. Are the benefits provided to people going to make an impact on what decisions are made or how people buy into those decisions? And so those are critical things to think about. Okay, we have another question. Would training agency experts include training on how to educate others on the guidebook, use the guidebook, or actual evaluation of ecosystem services? So we have materials for both of those things. We thought that the material on the guidebook itself would be most useful for folks, for example, our agency partners and other partners that have been part of this process, or to then communicate it on to the rest of their community and networks. We have the other piece of our training material from the training we did at the Conference on Ecosystem Services, the Community on Ecosystem Services Conference. That is just a general training on the methods. So there is a section on ecosystem services valuation and some of the other methods. It's not enough depth for someone to go out and then do it, but it is enough depth for them to understand what it is and what it takes to do ecosystem services valuation. So we have resources that can do both kinds of trainings. So a question about, as information about the ecosystem impact, especially in cascading or future impacts, may not be accurate, how is an ecosystem service approach adopted with limited information? So I'm not sure ecosystem services is different than any other kind of approach in trying to deal with limited information and future change. One of the things we've talked a lot about is how you might incorporate predicted climate change into ecosystem services, and it's really the same as anything else. You'd incorporate those potential changes in climate into your ecological models that you build into your ecosystem services assessments. And the uncertainty is inherent in this, requires an adaptive management approach, just like current management does. So in some ways, it's no different from any other approach in how you have to deal with uncertainties. So a specific example, we have a project in Brazil that works providing ecosystem services to companies. Would you consider us for field testing? So, at this point, we are interested in seeing these approaches applied, and so if it's a relevant application, we'd definitely be interested in finding out more and seeing what that would look like, because I think those detailed examples are going to be valuable moving forward. So one thing I should say, especially given that last question, is that if you're interested in talking in more detail about any of this, that you should please feel free to contact us or contact me directly. I'd be happy to talk more about opportunities to partner or engage in work related to this guidebook. So happy to do that. And maybe, can you provide my email? Okay. So we'll provide my contact information. So we have a question about whether there are, what are some of the challenges in implementing this type of approach? And so I'll just walk through a couple different kind of examples that have come up during our work with the agencies. So one thing is that people talk about using the technical term ecosystem services, and that's not that meaningful to people, and that may cause some confusion. But the interesting thing is, when we actually are applying ecosystem services on the ground, we really talk about the benefits that nature's providing. We talk about clean water, we talk about reduced flood risk, we talk about pollination of crops. And those things actually communicate very well with the public and improve communication. So we find that, the technical terms may be a problem, but we can get beyond those when we're working with people on the ground and with managers. Another thing people talk about is having insufficient technical capacity for doing this kind of work. And we think that, some of the agencies may not have the social science or economic capacity in the right places at this point, but they have a lot of that capacity in different places and may be able to pull that together in order to accomplish these kinds of approaches more broadly. We also think they work with consulting groups that could probably pull this capacity together as needed based on what's requested by the agencies. So those are some of the challenges we've discussed in the guidebook in more detail. So thank you very much for joining us today. Please do let us know if you have additional questions or want to follow up on anything. And thanks again.